tell you this morning about Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson is an Olympic sprinter. And he lined up to represent Canada in the 100-meter sprint in the Seoul Olympics of 1988. If you want to turn around, you can see a picture of him, because I still get a PowerPoint. He's a pretty impressive guy. There's been a lot of drama leading up to him leaning down and settling into his blocks. A lot of gamesmanship, too. But finally, he settled into his blocks. And within moments, the gun was going to go off and he was going to explode out of his starting stance. In fact, he started the race so well, he got such a lead that no one was going to be able to catch him. When he crossed the finish line, he did so with a victorious arm in the air and seemed so cool and casual in the whole thing that he was just like pointing off to his right as if he saw his friend crossing the street. He was so calm for someone who had just won a blistering 9.79 100-meter sprint. Just in case you're curious, that had shattered the previous world record by 1/10 of a second, which is a lot when you're talking about a 100-meter sprint. Even the two who placed second and third, as they're looking up to him from the podium, they're incredulous. They're wondering, where did you get that extra power? How do you have that much explosion? He was awarded a gold medal. For a short time, he got to bask in the glory of being the fastest man in the world. 24 hours later, the IOC, the International Olympic Federation, whatever it is, arrived at his room. He had tested positive for a steroid known as denosumab during the race. When they arrived at his room, he simply handed over the medal, to great consternation of his mother, by the way. One of the officials who was there described the scene as a wake. He had been disqualified. He was stripped of his gold medal, and his world record had been taken from him. I tell you that story Can I just talk real with you for a couple seconds? Can I just be really casual for a second or two? I want to tell you why I'm preaching this sermon. November 30th of this last year, I handed a document to the elders, and I said, here are 43 sermons I want to preach over the course of the next year, with text, title, and scripture reading. I try to be really prepared. And in that file, I said, I want to give a sermon about baptism. What's a text about baptism that I haven't talked about recently? And I had this curious passage in 1 Corinthians 10 in my head, which makes this really interesting comparison between baptism and what the Israelites experienced in the Red Sea. And I thought, I want to do a lesson about baptism from that. And so, at the end of June then, I handed him another document that said, this sermon is what I'm going to be preaching this given week. And I tell you that because this lesson is not what I had intended. I still owe you a baptism lesson. But it's because I started studying this text, and I saw the beauty of it. This isn't just a passage about baptism. And so I went back a little ways, and I started to see how it fit into the end of chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24. And I started to see Paul as he's talking about these Olympic runners, if you will, running in a race. And I also want to tell you that this isn't what I intended, because I wanted to actually avoid that passage. I feel like every preacher in the country is going to be talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 9 today. Do you know why? Because the Olympics are starting on Friday. And in this passage, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul is drawing on the Isthmian Games, an early version of the Olympics, to talk about the athletes and how that pertains to their spiritual walk. And I thought, every preacher is going to be doing that. I don't want to do that right now. But more than wanting to have a desire to talk about baptism in a day, or not talk about the Olympics, you know what I want to do? I want to give honor to this text. And I want to show you the beauty of this text. Turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting in verse 24. And we're going to go to chapter 10, verse 13. In it, Paul is going to talk about being disqualified. This is the Ben Jonson story. What he's going to do in chapter 9, verse 24 to 27 is he's going to introduce disqualification. And then in chapter 10, verses 1 through 10, he's going to talk about and illustrate what it means to be disqualified. And then finally, in verses 11 to 13, he's going to give some comfort and a warning to Christians today. So why I share this with you then is because I want to give you that warning and that comfort found in this passage. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting in verse 24, says this. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, starting in verse 24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it in order to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable one. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. I want to highlight to you just a few words from this passage to talk about what exactly he's explaining here. And the first one that I want to talk to you about is the concept of the prize. He says, do you not know that all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? He enters into this picture, this theme of reward and celebration. You could think of it as a trophy. You could think of it as a medal. You could think of it as a wreath. I'll tell you about the wreaths in just a second. I might think of trophies, but it's probably just because I'm a millennial, and you know millennials have gotten a lot of trophies, even if we didn't deserve one, right? But in this passage, he's talking about a prize as a celebration of accomplishment. And that's why he says, drawing on the runners of these Isthmian Games, these early Olympians, that they do so to receive a perishable wreath, he says. Do you know what you got if you won their early version of the Olympics? You got a wreath. It was woven and placed on your head. If you win the Olympics today, you get a gold medal. Well, these early wreaths, do you know what they were made out of? Some of them were made from pine straw. Others were made from laurel bushes or laurel trees. Some of them were even made of celery. There's a tradition for Olympians today, if they win, they get a gold medal. You know what they do with it? They bite it, because they want to test if it's real gold. If you did that during their time, it might have a very different effect. You might as well just ask for the ranch dressing. There was a point to this conversation about perishable wreaths, though. Paul was saying that what they achieve has a shelf life. It's not going to last. But that's why he says, but we, an imperishable one. And you might be thinking of what it's going to be like in heaven, what you're going to be wearing. Your robe's probably going to be white, probably going to be floor length, whatever. You might have wings. You might have a halo. You might have a crown. There's all kinds of things that have been associated with what we wear in heaven. But probably most predominantly is the concept of the crown. But Paul here isn't concerned with heavenly fashion. He's wanting you to think about heaven itself. He's wanting you to think about the prize that comes at the end for the triumphant Christian. And so he talks about a prize. But the next thing that he talks about is self-discipline. He says, every athlete exercises self-control in all things. Verse 25. The illustrations for this are beyond number. And you're going to see a lot of examples of them starting on Friday. Because even just within the event, within the moment of competition, what these athletes are able to make their bodies do is incredible illustrations of self-control. They're focused on form, the power that they put behind it. It's amazing within that moment, but that's not all that it is, a picture of self-discipline. Because what you don't see in that moment is the thousands of hours leading up to that. The thousands of hours of training, of discipline, of making sure that their bodies want to perform exactly the way they wanted to in the moment that they needed. And Paul is drawing on that image of the athlete and the self-discipline that's required to be that and to do that. But he brings it to himself. He says, so I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control. Here's how this passage fits within the larger context of 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and 10. Over the course of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul has said, I have a lot of rights that I'm not taking advantage of. I am being disciplined even in things that I'm allowed to have. He talks about in chapter 9 that he's allowed to eat and drink, that he's allowed to take a believing wife, that he's allowed to be materially compensated for his spiritual work. But here's what he says in verse 15. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. He is being disciplined to not partake in something that he knows he's allowed to. And he's using that as a transition to talk about a problem that's happening in Corinth. They're convinced, I'm allowed to eat from idols' temples. But they're exercising no self-control in what they've convinced themselves is okay. And so he's using this passage about self-discipline to launch back into that discussion. And becomes, therefore, a great opportunity to talk about what it means to be a self-disciplined Christian. But here's the third thing, the scariest thing that he talks about. He says in verse 24, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? You don't run aiming for second. You run aiming to win, right? Well, Paul isn't trying to create this picture of Christianity that it's a sense of competition, that only I'm going to get it and I have to do it at your expense. Otherwise, it might lead to the same kind of cheating that Ben Johnson was trying to facilitate so that he could cross the line first. But he does intimate that there are some who fail to obtain the prize, who fail to achieve it. And then he says at the end, mixing his metaphors, and this is the last word in this section. It should resonate with you. Lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. He's running the race right now. He's endeavoring as a Christian to serve the Lord, to honor him, to follow his path, to run the right direction. But he knows that if he should be undisciplined, that there's a possibility of being disqualified. That's why he gives them the exhortation at the end of verse 24. So run that you may obtain it. What he's telling them, and what I want to tell you right now, run in hope, run with discipline. Both of those things are necessary for the Christian. That's why I wanted to sing to you about heaven this morning. Because I want to get that hope that we have so thoroughly fixed in our minds that we know what we're running to. And that might motivate us to run with the discipline that is required. So here in this passage, he has introduced the concept of disqualification. But I want you to... Don't advance the slide for me. Just go back. So here in chapter 10, verse 1, he says, for. That's the only word I want to point out to you real quick. For. That means that what he's about to say is a continuation of this argument that he's making about being disqualified. Chapter divisions can be so unfortunate. But he says for, and he's going to therefore pick up this illustration about disqualification, and he's going to give that to you with a picture of the Exodus generation. This is the group of people that they saw the plagues in Egypt. They were in chains beforehand, making buildings and cities for Pharaoh. But they were the ones that God miraculously and powerfully intervened to bring out of the land of Egypt. This might be the generation that saw the most miracles and could most be described as the ones who were directly cared for by God. What an amazingly blessed group of people. And so he's going to start actually in the first couple verses giving us a few points of comparison between what they've experienced, though, and what the Christian experiences also. Here's what it says. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers... Stop. Concerning this generation, the people who left Egypt, he calls them our fathers. Now, that would be a really easy thing to do if Paul were talking to an entirely Jewish audience. Because they would literally biologically want to connect themselves to this group of people, their fathers. But Paul knows that he's not, that he's talking to a very racially diverse group. And in doing so, when he says our fathers, it's not because they're biologically related, but because the Exodus generation, become part of the Christian's spiritual heritage. If they're the Corinthians' fathers, they're your fathers too. Which brings this point of comparison by which we can understand our walk through what they experienced. So here's what he says next. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and passed through the sea. Verse 1. He's trying to call your mind back to Exodus chapter 14. In Exodus chapter 14, the people of Israel miraculously crossed the Red Sea. They have left Egypt. And having left Egypt, Pharaoh decides that was a terrible idea. I don't want them to leave. And he starts chasing them with his army. And so they arrive at the shoreline of the sea, the Red Sea. And so they've got Pharaoh on one side with his swords, and they've got an ocean in front of them. Which would you choose? To be stabbed or drowned? Because that's what they're looking at. That's what they feel like. But God gives them a wonderful third option. God, through Moses, parts the Red Sea. And it's this beautiful picture of water being pushed to the side so that they can walk across on dry ground. It's amazing what God did for them. But Paul is using this for a particular purpose. Here's what he says in verse 2. He says, and all were baptized into Moses. It's kind of a weird way to think about it, but think about it for just a second. They're walking, and they've got water on their sides, and they've got water above them. It's like they're immersed in water, which is what baptism means. Baptizo simply means immersed. And so it says that they were baptized, and he's drawing that into a spiritual parallel for Christians. That they're experiencing the same thing that you do. If you've been baptized into Christ, you've received the same thing that they did. And there's this really cool parallel. Just like the Israelites were submersed in water in their beginning of the relationship with God, Christians are immersed in water to begin their relationship with God. So he's drawing this parallel. The second thing that he says about them is verse 3, and all ate the same spiritual food. Now that's a really funny thing for him to say. Because in this passage, he's talking about the fact that they got to eat manna. This is in Exodus chapter 16. And in Exodus chapter 16, they barely left Egypt, and they're like, we're hungry. And so God says, I'm going to miraculously provide you food. And so you'd walk out, and it would look like it snowed in the morning. After the dew rose, it would look like it snowed. Not up north snow. I'm talking down here snow. Where it's just kind of flaky and across the ground, and if you wait too long, it's going to be gone by noon. That kind of flaky snow. But they could go gather it. And from this powder that was left all over the ground, they could make bread. And they were able to call it manna. Manna technically means, what is it? Did you ever have to eat mystery meat? I guess before mystery meat existed, this is mystery bread. Because that's what manna is. What is it? But they were able to make this bread. But this manna, this bread, had so much more connotation than just what they were eating, but just where it came from. They knew that it came from God. Ever since this text, they're going to call it bread from heaven. It's spiritual food. But I want you to note in chapter 10, verse 3, that he says, and they ate the same spiritual food. What spiritual food do you eat? What spiritual bread do you eat? It might taste like styrofoam right now, but he's talking about the Lord's Supper. The bread from heaven symbolized the body of Jesus. And so what Paul is doing is, this is the second point of comparison. He said, like Christians, these Israelites were baptized. Like Christians, these are partaking of communion. And then he says, verse 4, and all drank from the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. This one's really cool. So this is coming from Numbers chapter 17, and later on in, Exodus chapter 17 and Numbers chapter 21. And in both of those stories, they're thirsty, and they start complaining to God. God, we're thirsty. And Moses is instructed on the first time to strike this rock. And when he strikes the rock, rivers start pouring from it, and they're able to drink. God has miraculously given them spiritual drink. But then in Numbers chapter 21, he's again told, but this time speak to the rock. Talk to it. Instead, he takes his staff, smacks the thing, and water again issues forth from it. This was in defiance to the command of God. We can talk about that another day. But in both of those passages, they're drinking this miraculous water that's pouring forth from this rock. But Paul makes this really interesting comparison. He says, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. And he says, and the rock was Christ. Now this can begin all kinds of discussions about what's called pre-incarnate Christ. That is, before Jesus was born in Bethlehem, did he appear on earth? And now is not the time for that discussion. But there is a really cool parallel between what this rock was and what Jesus is. Jesus is the one that was struck, and yet after having been struck, issues life to all the people. It's kind of cool. So again, Paul is drawing this parallel, and he says, by the way, that the rock followed them, and the what you're supposed to see in the Christian life is Christians follow Christ. So these Israelites, they've been baptized, they partake of communion, and they have a relationship with Jesus. Now, if someone had those three things, baptized, partakes of communion, and has a relationship with Jesus, what would you say about them? Would you say that they're in a good relationship with God? Would you say that they're saved? That's the impression you're supposed to get. But then keep reading. Here's what it says. Verse 5, nevertheless, with most of them, God was displeased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. If I had a thing with blinking red lights right now, it should be flashing, going, danger, danger, danger. Because in this passage, he's issuing in, you might feel this moment of security to feel like, oh, everything's okay, everything's fine. Hold on, warning. He says in verse 6, now these things took place as an example for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. I want to now talk about this example, because he's now going to issue a warning to them. And in this warning, he's going to draw on some of the things that Israel did and some of their sins. So here's the first thing that it says of them. It says, and do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. That's the first thing that he tells them. And this is recalling the image of the golden calf. Israel has barely left Egypt. They're at Mount Sinai. Moses is up on top of the mountain receiving the law. And while they're down there, how many of you ladies are wearing earrings? How many of you are wearing earrings this morning? Okay, a good chunk of you. All right, so here's what they did. Don't be ashamed of your earrings. Miss Vicky's going, oh, God. What they did is they all took out their earrings and they all took off their necklaces and all of the gold that they just plundered from Egypt. And what they're told to do is give it to Aaron. So he takes all this gold. And the myth was he threw it into the fire and out came this cow. All of the gold had magically turned into a cow. At least that's what he told Moses. And what this scene shows is that the idolatry that they had learned in Egypt isn't just part of their past. It's their future as well. They might have come out of Egypt, but they haven't taken Egypt out of them. They're idolaters. But here's the next thing that it says about them. Verse 8. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. This is a reference to Numbers chapter 25 and Baal at Peor. What had happened in that scene is that this same generation, the Exodus generation, had come to Moab, essentially, and it's either that they're marrying Moabite women, or more likely they're just having rampant sex with them. That's kind of the picture that you get. And it's so atrocious to God, this flagrant immorality, that God sends this plague among them, and 23,000 of them have died. Well, the second thing that he tells them then is, we must not indulge in sexual immorality, as they did. The next thing that he says is, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did when they were destroyed by the serpents. This is a reference to Numbers chapter 21, in which the people again are just grumbling, complaining. At that point, they even say, let's start going back to Egypt. We'd rather be there. And God sends these serpents. They're called fiery serpents. And this is a really cool scene, because God's solution for this is to make a bronze or fired serpent, this statue. He hangs it up on a pole, and whoever looks at that is saved. See John chapter 3, this is a really cool connection to Christ. But in this passage, he's saying, don't put God to the test. Don't start trying to go a different way. Don't try to make him jealous for you. And then finally, he says, nor grumble, as some of them did when they were destroyed by the destroyer. This is a reference to Numbers chapter 14, in which the Exodus generation has now finally arrived at the border of Canaan, the promised land. And they send in spies, and they're trying to prepare militarily to take the land. And when they do, 10 of the spies come back and say, no, sorry guys, beautiful land, can't do it, let's go. and they grumbled against God. Now, these are the four things that Israel did. But why bring up these four things? Is Paul just pulling sins at random here? I'll pause for just a second to tell you, not only is this PowerPoint not working, not only are my notes having completely crashed and failed this morning, but also there's no clock on the back wall. You guys are all in trouble. No. We're almost done. But why pick these four sins? Why talk about these four things? Paul isn't picking them at random. He's identifying the exact sins that are threatening Corinth as well. To talk about idolatry, starting in chapter 8, you see that they feel it's completely okay to eat from these pagan temples. Concerning immorality, you see that in chapter 6, in which, at all, like there's so many examples of sexual immorality in Corinth, including chapter 5, in which one of the guys is sleeping with his mother-in-law, and it's just, there's so much sexual immorality. But in chapter 6, it's interesting, because that immorality is also connected to pagan sacrifice as well. The same as at Baal of Peor. And he doesn't just talk about testing God because it's random, but look at chapter 10, verse 22. His final question when talking about eating food sacrificed to idols is this: shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? Their very participation in this idolatry was as if testing God, trying to provoke him to jealousy and threatening their relation with him. And concerning grumbling, they're arguing the point. In chapter 8, there are those who are arguing, saying, no, this is completely okay. Paul, you're wrong. Kind of like the Israelites grumbled against Moses. So Paul isn't picking these sins at random. And now I want to note one more parallel between this Exodus generation and what's happening in Corinth. He highlights it in verse 5. I read over that real fast, but I want to read it again. Here's what it says. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. They died there in the wilderness. In fact, the whole point is that they weren't even allowed to enter the land after Numbers chapter 14 until that generation had passed away. So here's what it says about the sins they committed. In chapter 10, verse 7, speaking of the sin of the golden calf, do you know how many died there in Exodus? 3,000. 3,000 were killed. The Levites are told, get on your swords. And they go and they start killing all of those who participated in this idolatry. 3,000 of them died. And then it says concerning the Baal worship of Peor, that in Numbers chapter 25, 23,000 died in the plague. Then it says concerning Numbers chapter 21, in verse 9, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. And then finally, in Numbers chapter 14, nor grumble as some of them did when they were destroyed by the destroyer. Now, interestingly, in Numbers chapter 14, only a few died in that particular moment, but that's when the final curse is given. None of you are allowed to come in. They are all disqualified from the race. So Paul draws all of these comparisons so that he can lead to these verses. It says in verse 11, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Take a lesson from this, he says. Verse 12, therefore, let anyone thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall. There's a difference between confidence and pride. We can be confident in our salvation, in our relationship with Christ. I don't want you to leave today thinking, oh no, Josh has just spent all morning telling me if I'm a Christian that I need to worry because it's very possible that I'm going to be disqualified from my race. I'm not trying to fill you with fear here. But we do need to be cautious for being proud, for boasting, for feeling like we're so secure, I can literally do whatever I want because God is just going to be okay with me anyway. Because what we just learned from the Israelites who were baptized, who partook of communion, who had a relationship with Christ, if you will, that they still fell in the wilderness and were not able to enter the land of promise. He gives some comfort in verse 13. Here's what he says. No temptation has overtaken you, except that which is common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. How many of you have heard this verse quoted before? Give me some nods, it's okay. Yeah? I hear this verse quoted a lot, and usually the context in which I hear it is, whatever you're going through, whatever hardships you may be experiencing, God isn't giving you more than you can handle. And usually that reasoning terrifies me. And most everyone who's experiencing everything awful too. Because usually the request is, well, I wish God didn't think so much of me. But that's not the point of this passage. He's saying the spiritual danger that you're in, Corinthians, or participating in idolatry, sexual immorality, testing God and grumbling, you're not the first. And for us today, they're not the last. Same temptations face us as well. But it says God is faithful. While we can't separate the comfort from this passage from the warning in verse 12, we can get a picture that God, he says he'll give us an escape, a way out, our own personal exodus, if you will, that God will lead us to. So let me wrap up this morning then. Let me give you a few points as just race strategy, if you will. So what does it mean then for me to run my race in such a way as not to be disqualified? First, run for the prize. Run with hope. Have your thoughts so firmly fixed on your hope of eternity with God that it's like you're racing towards the finish line. You know, most people, when they start nearing the finish line, when they can see that tape, when they see that line, they don't run slower. They run faster. I'm almost there. And they can be filled with such exhilaration, such hope, that they keep running. Run with hope. Run for the prize. Here's the second thing I want to tell you from this text. Say no to yourself to receive the greatest yes. Temptations are oftentimes a level of, there's some self-control there. And it can feel really hard to say no. It's kind of like being on a diet. You get to that point where you're like, okay, yes, I want to do good, I want to do good, I want to do good, but that cake looks so wonderful. I don't know if cake's your thing, maybe cookies. I like cookies. Don't make me cookies. But when it comes to temptation, I'm not talking about chocolate at this point. I'm talking about real temptation. Saying no to that thing, exercising self-discipline, and actually practicing self-control isn't just a no. It's actually saying yes to the best thing, to our future hope. So saying no in the moment is saying yes in eternity. Say no to yourself to receive the greatest yes. Here's the third thing that I want to tell you from this text as your race strategy. God doesn't and is not willing to be second in your life. If he's going to race for your heart, he's not willing to come in second place. And if you're willing to put something else in front of him, practicing idolatry, if you will, he's not the one who loses the prize. God isn't willing to come in second place in your life. So here's the last thing I want to tell you. The race isn't over. If you're running well, if you're a Christian right now, you're running well, the race isn't over. Keep running. And if you're not doing well, if you feel like you're struggling in your relationship with God, let me tell you, the race isn't over. And God is faithful. And there is hope for you. We don't have to be disqualified, but can attain and receive the prize of God. Oh, can you just cut that out? Or cut that off or whatever. Right now we're going to sing one more song. And the song is called Hilltops of Glory. It's song number 83 in your supplement books. Song number 83 in your supplement books. Way down in Egypt, mid-burning sand, Moses had started for Canaan's land. Never turn backwards. Always ascend unto the journey's end. Hilltops of glory, I now can see. Oh, brother, won't you come, go with me? Safe on the mountain, I soon shall stand. Hilltops of glory land. I want you to hear a couple things in that. Brother, sister, come with me. Let's run this race together. And if you need help in whatever aspect it might be, to begin a relationship with Jesus in baptism, to be immersed in water, or to return to discipline. Whatever your need may be, come forward to the front row. Always sing the song.
Onward rejoicing, I tread life's way. Higher I'm climbing, each passing day. Hilltops of glory, now rising near, where all shall be made new. Hilltops of glory, I now can see. Oh, brother, won't you come go with me? Safe on the mountain, I soon shall stand. Hilltops of glory land. Way down in Egypt, in burning sand, Moses had started for Canaan's land. Never turn backward, always ascend onto the journey's end. Hilltops of glory, I now can see. Oh, brother, won't you come go with me? Safe on the mountain, I soon shall stand. Hilltops of glory land. Footsteps of Jesus before us lead. We tread life's journey
one more thing before you wrap up?
Sure.
I want to tell you guys that tonight I am really excited. 6 o'clock, we're going to be together, and the sermon series that we're beginning is called God Unseen, Lessons from Esther. If you feel like it's hard on a daily basis to feel like I know what God's doing and I know what He wants from me, then you can appreciate the book of Esther. Because in the book of Esther, you don't see God, but you see His powerful hand moving in wonderful ways. You can see what God does even when He's unseen and how we fit into His picture. So join us tonight at 6 o'clock for God Unseen.
Certainly appreciate the attendance of everyone today. And like Josh said, we'll meet again this evening at 6 o'clock for the first time, I believe, since October or November. So we look forward to that. At this time, we'll go ahead and be dismissed with our closing prayer.
Let us pray. Dear Lord in heaven, we give thanks to you for this service we've had this morning. We pray that we would it would strengthen ourselves and run the race as you intended to run, and we would be fruitful in our ways. Lord, we ask that you be with those who are members that have been mentioned that are sick and recovering, and we ask that you help them and guide them so that they regain their health. Lord, we give thanks to you for all the many blessings